The Black Company by Glen published May of 1984. Book 1, the Black Company series. This tome here is actually the first three Black Company books put together, but I only read the first one so far. It's about, I think, the first third of this, give or take. I've read this much, and that's what we're here to talk about. So I'd heard about this book and this entire series for quite a while now. It's a bit of a minor game changer in the world of fantasy back in the 80s, very much scaling back the elves and the dwarves and the epic heroism and the dragons, and kind of scaling up the grittiness and the darkness and the moral ambiguity and the realistic depiction of military matters. And I'd say it basically lives up to that, with our titular heroes, the Black Company, basically working for the villains, kind of de facto stormtroopers, and they're also up against similarly kind of morally ambiguous good guys, with barely a heroic motive to be found on either side anywhere in the novel. But despite kind of a interesting moral grayness going on there and interesting things going on in the novel's structure, I'm not entirely sure how much I'd say I actually liked it. I didn't dislike it, certainly didn't hate it at all. Interesting things going on here, but I definitely didn't love it either. So let's go into it and discuss why. But maybe I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit. Let's talk plot. So basically, the book is presented in first person, actually, unusual for an epic fantasy novel, like I did this, I said that, me, and so on. Pretty unusual, and by a character named Croker. Of all the epic fantasy protagonist names possible, we went with Croker. Okay. Croker is a medic. He's the chronicler of the Black Company. We're reading his basically journal of the Black Company's missions as we read this novel, and an occasional archer. You'd call him a jack of all trades for this mercenary crew. The Black Company, through most of the novel, works as kind of the common grunt soldiers for a dark empress only called the Lady. She's kind of an ancient witch, demi-goddess type who basically seems to be sort of the Sauron of this world, or for you fellow Willow fans out there, the Bav Morda, perhaps I should say, in this world called the Northern Empire. Basically just kind of a generic, kind of gritty fantasy land of feuding armies and muddy towns. Think Westeros if you removed kind of some of the richer history and characterization of the regions. Croker's arc, and I guess this is kind of minor spoilers, so click away if you were still planning on getting around to this one after a third of a century, is kind of a classic
Are we the baddies?
arc, gradually going from looking up to, respecting, maybe even loving the Lady, to being a bit conflicted about her missions and motives, to basically eventual just open hatred of her, while still being unable to turn his back on his brothers. So between a rock and a hard place, Croker finds himself. For all my fellow JRPG, Super Nintendo nerds, think Cecil's story from the first few scenes of Final Fantasy IV, but just spread across the entire novel, and not just the very beginning. Now, this probably all sounds pretty good, minus the protagonist being named Croker, of course. But the problem for me is, honestly, and sorry to Glen Cook, and this isn't often something I complain about here on the book club, it's the prose itself, the writing, the sentences, the descriptions, the word choices, and so on. The descriptions are so thin, the sentences are so short and so brusque, I guess. Let's just read a sample. Raven closed in on himself. So did I. I was scared silly. My stomach was in revolt. I do not know about Raven. The stars began to fade. The eastern horizon lightened. The earth materialized below us. I chanced to look. We were over the forest of cloud. A little more light. Catcher grunted, considered the east, then the distances ahead. He seemed to listen for a moment, then nodded. The carpet raised its nose. We climbed. Basically, I swear the average sentence length in this entire book must be like 6 to 8 words through the whole thing. Just blunt, short sentence after blunt, short sentence after blunt, short sentence through the entire novel, with settings very thinly described, almost all kind of left to your imagination, and mostly pretty thin characters as well. Even kind of the greater story is kind of blunt and brief, with entire military campaigns that could have taken up 50, 60 pages of book, just summed up in a sentence like, we raided the city, we won, we spent the summer fighting rebels, the battle raged for 3 days, there were many losses, stuff like that. And it's kind of like, well, I want to know more about the battle, I want to know more about the raid, I want to know more about this and this. And now I'm not advocating for a full-blown purple prose or anything, or I don't know. Fuck, maybe I am. I don't presume to speak for all fantasy fans out there, but personally I love kind of flowing, poetic sentences and richly detailed descriptions of settings and mood and cities and landscapes and weather and detailed battles and all that. And I don't know. I just kind of missed it here. There's too far the other way, of course. Everyone makes fun of fantasy books that feel like they have to describe every stitch of everyone's clothing and every bite of everyone's meals, and but this is too far the other extreme. I feel like it was just also very, very blunt through the whole novel. Is just a blunt novel, bluntly written, blunt characterization, and I don't know, something about that was just kind of, it was missing something for me. And for a fantasy epic spanning years and the campaigns of a great military company, there are very, very few characters on our side that we really learn much of anything about. There's basically just our main guy, Croker, this one kind of black company badass named Raven, the company wizards, One Eye and Goblin, the captain, just called the captain through the whole book. Pretty much just kind of your standard gruff military leader guy, and this one kind of mightier sorcerer who works more closely with the lady called Soulcatcher. A bit of an interesting character there, but that's basically it for the whole novel. Just about 6 dudes on our side we get to know anything about, and that's it. Pretty much everyone is fairly one-dimensional too. The only ones I would even call two-dimensional are Croker himself, arguably Raven, as he's both kind of a scowling, merciless killer, but he also dotes on this young mute girl named Darling he rescued during a raid, so there's a little bit of a inner contradiction there, and I guess the lady herself, who kind of hides her villainy behind a thin layer of a good PR. But that's really it. Everyone else is pretty much just a name and maybe one trait. That one trait usually being either gruff or wizard or asshole. And there are maybe a dozen, little more than a dozen other names in there, but they all just kind of smeared together into nothingness for me. Like one guy in the black company is named Elmo. Couldn't tell you one thing about his personality, what he looks like, his specific skills, anything. I can just tell you that the name showed up a bunch of times. We got Elmo up in here. I don't know, so I feel a little too negative here maybe. Like I said, I didn't hate the book. I did finish it, and I usually don't finish books I hate because life's too fucking short. Maybe I'd even consider reading the sequels one day. There were interesting things in the book's structure. So, minus the very short epilogue chapter of just a few pages, the entire book consists of 6 rather long chapters, and each one is kind of a sort of a short story, almost a novella on its own, each presenting a different mission of the Black Company. For example, chapter 1 is the one chapter before they work for the lady, and it's largely about them being hired to hunt down a monster in the city. Chapter 3 is about setting up a trap to catch this rebel leader named Raker, and them having to surveil the trap for a long period of time. The last main chapter before the epilogue, which I mentioned, is basically a big all-out war near the Ladies' Tower. And the chapters kind of stand alone. They each almost have a 3-act structure in themselves, with Croker's evolving or devolving, I should say, opinions on the lady forming the main kind of connective tissue between them. It almost feels like this could have been a serial, published week by week, or I guess I should say 1 month at a time, a month apart, in like a fantasy zine or something in the day. I know that wasn't actually what it was, but that's how it kind of feels almost when you read it. And this is actually a pretty cool structure that it totally makes sense for a military fantasy novel. Campaign after campaign, mission after mission, the dangerous but repetitive nature of warfare. As I said, my problems with the Black Company don't revolve around the greater ideas or the structure, but more just the page by page, sentence by sentence execution. I guess it's like the novel's like a burger with a really great bun, but the patty's a little on the dry side. Now, what's interesting in it is watching the kind of evolution of the Silver Age of the fantasy novel well after Tolkien, but before what I guess we would call the truly modern era, which I would argue kind of started in the 90s. Kind of feeling out what a darker version of fantasy would be. Now, there are legitimately, unsettling passages here of villages being pillaged and raped and plundered, akin to stuff we'd see from later fantasy works, such as the obvious tired comparison that I try not to make all the time here on Zio's Book Club, but I always end up doing. George R.R. Martin, Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, all that. But at the same time, it's kind of funny, where in modern fantasy, a gritty tone often seems to be paired with more kind of realistic trappings in terms of subtle, low magic, and so on. That is not the case in the slightest here. This is as high magic as anything else out there, with a magic system that is as ruleless and willy-nilly and free-for-all as Harry Potter. I'm talking battle magic, spells being flung back and forth, fireballs, lightning, all that, wizards transforming people into animals, changing the weather, casting illusions, setting magical traps, psionic powers, rituals, straight up like Aladdin-style flying carpets play a significant role in like the novel, and then the battle tactics. So there's just magic, straight from pretty much page 1 straight through to the end of the final chapter. Is not a novel of subtle magic. Like, there's way more magic than even like the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I guess if a twist exists at all in this respect, it's maybe in that our actual protagonist and viewpoint character, Croker, can't use any magic and is just an observer to these arcane powers. But I guess that's kind of true of Frodo also, isn't it? But it's kind of interesting thing, this funny little nexus point in the genre of fantasy in the 80s, where dark military tones and high magic now generally divorced, briefly and harmoniously lived side by side. It's kind of it's a little funny. It's one way the novel kind of stood out to me. For all my criticism, I did start getting more into the book in the last quarter or so, the last kind of chapter or two, when the stakes ramp up. The lady starts appearing on screen more and more, involving Croker and her plans, and much to his dismay and despair, it's kind of like a violent and fantastical high-stakes version of not wanting to be assigned special projects by your boss at work. One funny bit that I did kind of like and appreciate is when Croker first sees Ladies' Tower in person. He's by this point, he's come to view her as more of a vile Sauron-esque figure, and then there's kind of a meta fantasy commentary within the narration where he kind of glibly comments about how it's underwhelming seeing her tower, because it's not a giant black tower of evil surrounded by lava and black clouds and smoke, or cloaked in howling ice, but it's just kind of jutting straight up from like beautiful green plains and farmland, and under just lovely blue skies. And I kind of enjoyed the winking meta commentary of that. Why would what's the point of being a high lord ruling over your lands if you live in a shitty neighborhood, right? So that was a fun bit. I did enjoy that little passage. And then the last chapter does contain some kind of cool battle sequences that go into a little more depth. So yeah, towards the end of the book, I was kind of finally starting to reach a place where I was looking forward to grabbing it off my little nightstand and reading a little more. But the first half was often a struggle. I mean, I did, in the first couple chapters, think about just calling this a whiff and putting it down. I strongly considered it. I didn't. I did, push through to the end, but it took me a little while to get into. And honestly, like I said, a lot of that probably just comes down to the prose, the thin descriptions and characterization, the short sentences, the lack of real backstory, the thin settings, and I felt like the book itself was skimming over stuff in greater storyline and in individual scenes. Some might argue that this kind of makes sense as it's kind of written as a military journal, and they're probably right. I'll just say they're probably right, but it's just a taste thing. And for me personally, just a little something that I enjoy in reading fantasy was missing here. And I could easily count on one hand the number of characters in the entire novel that I so much would have raised an eyebrow, much less felt sad if just an arrow had suddenly come in flying from out of nowhere and killed them. Like, this wasn't a novel where I was deeply invested in, 24 different characters, which is kind of like, you guys are okay. Yeah, I'm not too gripped by any of you. So overall, I can definitely respect what this novel was trying to do, and sort of playing with the tropes and the morality of epic fantasy in an era when the genre was certainly more associated with heroism and fighting against the Dark Lord. And it was the post Tolkien days still, and most fantasy novels were kind of using Tolkien's races over and over again, and they don't do that here. And I can also respect what Glen Cook is doing with kind of the interestingly episodic mission-based structure of it, which still seems pretty fresh even today. But the blunt prose, the thin characters, and all in all, they didn't really entirely do it for me. So overall, I probably have to say the Black Company for me is kind of a thumb sideways at best. Plenty of other stuff I'd recommend over it, and I'm not in any huge rush to get to the sequels, if I ever do. But yeah, alright, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all back here on the book club real soon. Peace.